At exactly 7:43 on a cold Manhattan morning, Billionaire CEO Richard Calloway looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 72nd floor and made a decision that would change his life forever. Get rid of her. 3 simple words. 3 words directed at a woman he barely noticed. A woman who sat 4 floors below him. A woman whose employee badge identified her as nothing more than an administrative coordinator. A woman he believed worked for him. What Richard didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was that within 90 days, that same woman would legally become the most powerful person in his entire company. And by then, it would already be too late. Because this story isn't about a billionaire who built an empire. It's about a billionaire who discovered that empires don't always belong to the people sitting on the throne. Sometimes, they belong to the person nobody is paying attention to. Her name was Emily Carter. At 28 years old, Emily lived in a small apartment in Queens. She drove an aging Honda, packed her own lunch, and never cared much about appearances. To everyone around her, she was just another employee trying to make it through another work week. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. For 5 years, Emily had quietly become one of the most valuable people inside Calloway Technologies. Whenever projects failed, she found solutions. Whenever departments struggled, she fixed problems nobody else could solve. Yet promotions always went to someone else. Credit always landed in someone else's hands. At first, she cared. Then she stopped expecting recognition. Because she had learned something about large corporations. The people creating value and the people receiving applause were often 2 completely different groups. Meanwhile, Richard Calloway lived in a different reality. At 58, he was one of America's most celebrated CEOs. Financial networks praised him. Investors trusted him. Business magazines called him a visionary. His company was worth billions, and his personal fortune seemed to grow every year. But success had changed him. The larger his empire became, the further he drifted from the people who actually kept it running. That Monday morning, Richard wasn't interested in details. He was interested in finding someone to blame. A major product launch had been delayed. Investors were asking questions. Analysts were becoming skeptical. The board wanted answers. And pressure always flowed downhill. At 9:11 a.m., an email appeared in Emily's inbox. Executive conference room. Immediate attendance required. Her stomach tightened. People at her level didn't get summoned by the CEO. Not unless something was wrong. Minutes later, she stepped into the executive conference room and immediately sensed the tension. 7 senior executives sat around the table. Richard stood near the windows. Nobody smiled. Nobody greeted her. Emily Carter? Richard asked. Yes, sir. Do you know why you're here? No, sir. Then allow me to explain. He tossed a report across the table. Emily looked down and instantly recognized it. Project Horizon. The delayed launch. Richard folded his arms. This failure happened under your department's coordination. Emily frowned. Sir, my team submitted multiple risk reports 6 weeks ago. Several executives shifted in their seats. Because she was telling the truth. The reports existed. The warnings existed. The recommendations existed. They had simply been ignored. But Richard wasn't interested in hearing that. We're not discussing reports, he said coldly. We're discussing results. Emily took a slow breath. With respect, the delays came from executive decisions. The room went silent. Nobody challenged Richard publicly, especially not someone in Emily's position. His expression hardened immediately. Are you blaming leadership? No. Then what are you doing? Emily met his eyes. Telling the truth. The words landed like a stone in still water. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard stared at her. Not with anger. With offense. Because powerful people often accept mistakes more easily than they accept contradiction. Then he made his decision. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. The room froze. 5 years. Gone in a single sentence. No investigation. No discussion. No second chance. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. Yet strangely, she didn't panic. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. Instead, she felt something unexpected. Relief. As though a door had quietly opened somewhere in the distance. Richard seemed confused by her reaction. That's it, he asked. Emily closed her notebook. Yes. No defense. No. No explanation. She looked directly at him, then said something nobody in the room would forget. "I learned a long time ago that people only hear the truth when they're ready for it." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Richard's face. Only for a second, then it vanished. Emily turned and walked toward the door. But before leaving, she reached into her bag and placed a sealed envelope on the conference table. Richard frowned. "What is that?" "You'll find out soon." Without another word, she walked out. The door closed behind her. And just like that, the meeting ended. Hours later, Richard had almost forgotten about the envelope, until an urgent call arrived from one of New York's most powerful law firms. Then another call came, and another. Within 30 minutes, 3 members of the board demanded an emergency meeting. Suddenly, everyone seemed nervous, even people who were never nervous. Confused, Richard finally opened the envelope Emily had left behind. Inside was a single legal document. At the top was a name he hadn't seen in more than 20 years. The name of the company's original founder. A man everyone believed had died with no surviving claim to the company. Richard's face lost all color, because according to the document in his hands, that founder had secretly updated his will just months before his death. And the sole beneficiary wasn't Richard. It wasn't the board. It wasn't the shareholders. It was Emily Carter, the woman he had fired less than 12 hours earlier. Richard read the document 3 times, then a 4th. Each time, he expected the words to change. They didn't. The conference room had gone completely silent. 3 board members sat across from him, watching his reaction carefully. Finally, Richard looked up. "This is impossible." Nobody answered, because nobody in the room was willing to make promises they couldn't keep. Richard slammed the document onto the table. "Emily Carter is an administrative coordinator." One of the board members slowly shook his head. "No, Richard." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" The older man leaned back in his chair. "It means that's who you thought she was." For the first time that evening, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Unease. The kind that appears when a situation no longer follows the rules you understand. He looked down at the legal paperwork again. The founder's signature was authentic. The witnesses were legitimate. The law firm was one of the most respected in the country. Everything was real. And according to the documents, Emily Carter had inherited controlling ownership rights connected to a private trust that had existed for decades. A trust Richard knew almost nothing about. "Explain this," he demanded. The board members exchanged glances. None of them seemed eager to speak. Finally, the chairman cleared his throat. 26 years ago, before Calloway Technologies became a billion-dollar company, there were 2 founders. Richard's jaw tightened. He already knew where this conversation was heading. The problem was that he didn't want to go there. The chairman continued, "Everyone remembers your name, but very few remember Daniel Carter." The room became quiet again. Daniel Carter, the name Emily had placed in front of him, the name he had spent years trying not to think about, because before investors, before the skyscrapers, before the private jets, there had been 2 young men sharing a tiny office with broken furniture and impossible dreams. Richard and Daniel, partners, friends, brothers in everything except blood. Daniel had been the engineer, the genius, the man who could solve problems nobody else understood. While Richard built relationships and attracted investors, Daniel built the technology that made the company valuable. Together they were unstoppable. Until everything changed. 22 years earlier, Daniel disappeared from public life after a devastating illness. The company announced his retirement. The media moved on. Investors focused on growth. And eventually most people forgot he had ever existed. Most people, but not all. The chairman slid another file across the table. Inside were photographs. Old photographs. Pictures from the early days of the company. Richard and Daniel standing side by side, smiling, celebrating their first major contract, their first office, their first breakthrough. Looking at those images felt like opening a door to a life he barely recognized anymore. "What does this have to do with Emily?" Richard asked. The chairman looked directly at him. "Everything." Richard's stomach tightened. The answer came before the question. "She's his daughter." Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The truth settled over the room like a storm cloud. Emily Carter wasn't just an employee. She wasn't just another staff member. She was Daniel Carter's daughter. the daughter of the man who had helped create the company from nothing. Richard stared at the photographs. Memories flooded back. He remembered meeting Emily once when she was very young. A little girl running through the office carrying a stuffed rabbit. Daniel laughing as he chased after her. Richard hadn't thought about that memory in years. Now it returned with startling clarity. "Why didn't she tell anyone?" he asked quietly. The chairman almost laughed. "Tell anyone what? Who she was?" The older man folded his hands. "Maybe because she wanted to be treated like everyone else." Richard looked away. That answer hurt more than he expected. Because if it was true, then she had succeeded. For 5 years, nobody had treated her differently, including him, especially him. And now he remembered dozens of meetings where she had spoken up with ideas executives later presented as their own. Ideas he had praised without ever knowing where they came from. Suddenly, memories began connecting themselves. Reports, recommendations, solutions, operational improvements. Her fingerprints were everywhere. Yet he had never noticed. Not once. Then the chairman delivered the worst news of the evening. The inheritance becomes effective in 83 days. Richard froze. What? 83 days? That's impossible. The legal transfer is already underway. Richard felt his pulse accelerating. How much control are we talking about? The room fell silent again. A silence that felt dangerous. Finally, the company's attorney answered. Enough! Richard narrowed his eyes. Enough for what? The attorney swallowed. Enough to replace the CEO. The words hit like a freight train. 4 years, Richard had believed the company was his. Not legally, not entirely, but practically. Nobody challenged him. Nobody threatened him. Nobody had the power. Until now. He stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly into the darkness. Normally the view made him feel powerful. Tonight it made him feel small. For the first time in decades, control was slipping through his fingers. Then his phone vibrated. A new email. The sender's name immediately caught his attention. Emily Carter. The subject line contained only 4 words. "We need to talk." Richard opened it. The message was short, professional, calm. There was no anger, no revenge, no threats. Just one sentence. "Tomorrow morning at 9, I'd like to discuss the future of the company." Richard read it twice, then 3 times. What unsettled him most wasn't the message itself. It was the confidence behind it. Emily wasn't acting like someone who had just been fired. She was acting like someone preparing for a transition. As if she already knew something he didn't. As if she could already see a future he couldn't. And deep down, for the first time in many years, Richard began to fear that the future of Calloway Technologies might no longer belong to him. Because while he had spent decades building an empire, someone else had quietly inherited the keys. Richard barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the same question returned. How had he missed this? How had a woman worked inside his company for 5 years without him realizing who she really was? At 8:47 the next morning, Richard arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. The building felt different. Or maybe he felt different. For years he had walked through those glass doors as the unquestioned authority. The man everyone answered to. The man who controlled the future of thousands of employees. Now, for the first time, uncertainty followed him into the building. At exactly 9 a.m., Emily Carter entered the executive conference room. She wasn't dressed differently. She wasn't surrounded by attorneys. She wasn't trying to make a statement. In fact, she looked exactly like she always had. Calm, professional, focused. Yet somehow the entire room felt different the moment she walked in. Richard stood as she approached, a gesture he rarely made for anyone. Emily noticed but said nothing. The board members watched quietly. Nobody seemed sure how this meeting would unfold. Finally, Richard spoke. "Thank you for coming." Emily sat down. "You asked for this meeting." The response wasn't rude, but it wasn't warm either. Richard nodded. "You're right." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Years of history sat between them. Some known, some hidden, some only beginning to surface. Then Richard got straight to the point. "Why did you come work here?" Emily looked at him carefully, almost as if deciding how much truth he was ready to hear. "Because my father asked me to." The answer caught everyone off guard, even the board members. Richard frowned. "Your father?" Emily nodded. Before he died, the room became silent. My father believed this company had lost its way. Richard's expression hardened slightly. What does that mean? It means he stopped recognizing it. The words landed heavily. Emily continued. He wasn't concerned about profits. He wasn't concerned about growth. He was concerned about culture. The board members exchanged nervous glances, because everyone knew she wasn't entirely wrong. Calloway Technologies had become enormously successful, but success had changed things. Departments competed instead of collaborating. Politics mattered more than performance. Executives protected their positions. Employees felt invisible. And somewhere along the way, the values that built the company had begun to disappear. My father wanted to know if the company could still be saved. Richard stared at her. And he sent you? Emily nodded. He asked me to work here anonymously. The chairman leaned forward. For 5 years. Yes. The room fell silent again. 5 years. 5 years of observation. 5 years of learning. 5 years of seeing the company from the inside. Without anyone realizing who she was, Richard suddenly remembered dozens of moments. Times Emily had identified problems before anyone else. Times she had predicted failures. Times she had suggested solutions that saved millions of dollars. At the time, he barely noticed. Now those memories felt very different. Did you report everything back to him? Richard asked. Emily's eyes lowered briefly. No. Richard frowned. What do you mean? My father died 3 years after I joined the company. The room instantly softened. Even Richard felt a wave of regret. For a moment, Emily wasn't an heir. She wasn't a future owner. She was simply a daughter talking about her father. Before his death, Daniel Carter had left her something far more valuable than money. A mission, a responsibility, a promise. My father loved this company, she said quietly. More than anyone realized. Richard looked away. Because he knew that was true. Daniel had sacrificed everything for the business. Relationships, time, health, eventually even his future. Then Emily reached into her folder. What is that? Richard asked. A report. The board members exchanged curious looks. Emily placed several documents on the table. Each one contained detailed findings. Employee satisfaction surveys, retention statistics, leadership evaluations, internal complaints, department performance reviews, years of information, years of observations, years of truth. Richard flipped through the pages. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Morale was falling. Turnover was increasing. Trust in leadership was declining. And one name appeared repeatedly throughout the data. Richard Calloway. The room became painfully quiet. Emily didn't need to attack him. The facts were doing it for her. Then she delivered the sentence nobody expected. I don't think you're a bad person. Richard looked up, surprised. I think you're a man who became disconnected from the consequences of his decisions. For the first time, nobody disagreed. Not even Richard. Because deep down, he knew there was truth in those words. Years of success had created distance. Distance from employees. Distance from reality. Distance from accountability. Then Emily opened another file. This one changed everything. What is this? Richard asked. A proposal. For what? Emily met his eyes. The future. The board members immediately leaned forward. Inside the proposal was a complete restructuring plan. Leadership reforms. Compensation changes. Employee ownership programs. Transparency measures. Cultural rebuilding initiatives. It wasn't a hostile takeover plan. It wasn't revenge. It was a blueprint. A blueprint designed to save the company. Richard stared at the pages. The more he read, the more shocked he became. Because it was brilliant. Not good. Brilliant. The kind of strategic thinking that transformed organizations. The kind investors loved. The kind boards rewarded. The kind leaders feared. Then the chairman broke the silence. Who helped you create this? Emily answered immediately. No one. Richard looked up sharply. No one. She shook her head. I've been working on it for years. Years. While everyone believed she was simply another employee, she had been preparing, studying, planning, waiting. Not for power, for the opportunity to make things better. Then the company attorney suddenly entered the room. His expression looked unusually serious. Immediately, everyone sensed something was wrong. "What happened?" the chairman asked. The attorney swallowed. "There's been a development." Richard stood. "What kind of development?" The attorney placed a document on the table. The room went silent as everyone read the first page. Richard's face drained of color. Because the inheritance wasn't the biggest secret Daniel Carter had left behind. Not even close. There was another clause, another legal provision hidden inside the trust, one that had remained sealed for over 20 years. And according to the document now sitting on the table, Emily Carter wasn't merely inheriting part of the company. She was inheriting authority that could take effect immediately. Authority powerful enough to change everything before those 83 days were over. And for the first time, Richard realized he might lose control of his empire much sooner than anyone expected. The room fell into complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every eye remained fixed on the document, lying in the center of the conference table. Richard grabbed the papers and began reading faster. Then faster still. The deeper he read, the worse his expression became. "This can't be legal," he finally said. The company attorney sighed. "It is." Richard looked up sharply. "No, it absolutely is." The attorney adjusted his glasses and pointed toward a specific section. Daniel Carter created a protective governance clause 21 years ago. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Most of them had never seen the clause themselves. Only a handful of attorneys had access to it. Until now, Emily remained calm. She hadn't touched the document, hadn't reacted, hadn't celebrated. Richard noticed. "You knew about this." Emily nodded. "Only recently." The answer surprised him. "You didn't know?" "No." The attorney confirmed it. The clause remained sealed until yesterday. Richard looked back down. According to the trust agreement, if company leadership demonstrated repeated patterns of negligence, misconduct, or actions harmful to long-term shareholder interests, the trust's beneficiary could request an emergency governance review. A review powerful enough to suspend executive authority while an independent investigation was conducted. Richard slowly lowered the document. The implications were enormous. If activated, his authority as CEO could effectively be frozen. Not permanently, but long enough to change everything. For years, Richard had believed no one possessed the power to challenge him. Now he was staring at proof that someone did. The chairman finally broke the silence. "Emily, are you planning to activate it?" Every person in the room waited for her answer. Even Richard. Especially Richard. Emily folded her hands, then surprised everyone. "No." Several heads turned. The attorney looked confused. The chairman blinked. Richard stared at her. "What?" "I'm not activating it." For a moment nobody understood. After everything that had happened, after being fired, after discovering her inheritance, after gaining unprecedented leverage, why wouldn't she use it? Richard narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Emily looked directly at him. "Because this was never about taking your position." The answer hit harder than any accusation. She continued, "My father didn't build this company so people could fight over control." The room remained silent. He built it to create opportunity. Richard felt something unfamiliar. Guilt. A deep, uncomfortable guilt he hadn't experienced in years. Emily opened her folder again. Inside were dozens of letters, employee testimonials, personal stories, messages from workers throughout the company, engineers, managers, designers, support staff, people from every department. "What are those?" Richard asked. The people were supposed to be serving. She handed several letters to him. One by one, he began reading. Employees describing burnout, frustration, lack of recognition, fear of speaking honestly, fear of losing their jobs, fear of leadership. The words felt impossible to ignore, because many of them sounded familiar. Too familiar. They sounded exactly like Emily had sounded the day before. Suddenly Richard understood something. He hadn't fired Emily because she failed. He fired her because she told him something he didn't want to hear. And that realization was far more painful than any legal threat. Minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Then Emily finally stood. "I don't want your job." Richard looked up. "Then what do you want?" The answer came instantly. "A better company." Simple. Direct. Honest. For years, Richard had expected competitors to attack him, investors to challenge him, activist shareholders to pressure him. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Financial networks debated it. Business podcasts analyzed it. Investors demanded answers. The headlines spread across the country. The billionaire CEO who fired the woman set to inherit his empire. By the next morning, Calloway Technologies had become the most talked-about company in America. Reporters gathered outside headquarters. Employees filled internal forums with speculation. The board prepared for what many expected to be a corporate war. But that war never happened. Because inside the executive conference room, Richard Calloway made a decision nobody saw coming. He stood before the board, looked at Emily Carter, and said something he had not said in years. "I was wrong." The room fell silent. For decades, Richard had built a reputation as a man who never admitted mistakes. Yet here he was doing exactly that. He turned toward the board. Emily was right about the culture. Then toward the executives. She was right about leadership. And finally toward Emily. And I was wrong to fire her. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Richard did something even more unexpected. He signed the partnership proposal. Not because he had lost. Not because he had been forced. But because for the first time in a long time, he understood what Daniel Carter had wanted all along. A company wasn't just buildings. It wasn't stock prices. It wasn't power. A company was people. Over the following months, Calloway Technologies transformed. Employee ownership programs were introduced. Leadership became more transparent. Departments worked together instead of against one another. Turnover dropped. Innovation increased. And trust slowly returned. As for Emily, she officially joined the executive leadership team. Not as a conqueror, not as a replacement CEO, but as a partner. Someone determined to protect the values her father had helped create. 1 year later, the company achieved its strongest performance in history. Investors celebrated. Employees celebrated. Even the media had to admit that the unlikely partnership was working. One evening, long after the headlines had disappeared, Richard and Emily stood in the same office overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly below. "It should have been easier for you to hate me," Richard said. Emily smiled slightly. "My father taught me something." Richard looked at her. "What?" She glanced out at the skyline. "He said the goal isn't to inherit power." She paused. "It's to leave things better than you found them." For a moment, neither spoke. Because they both knew the truth. The empire had never really been the inheritance. The responsibility was. And in the end, the billionaire CEO discovered something worth far more than control. He discovered that the strongest leaders aren't the ones who hold power the longest. They're the ones willing to share it. And that was the lesson that changed an empire forever.